carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. When I close my eyes, I can see your face, and an ocean of love washes over me, and I am in your presence. Carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. When I hear your voice, the power of your word, oceans of peace flood right through my heart. I live for you, and I embrace your holiness. Carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. Carry me away, lift me from this place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away. This place, ease my burdens, Lord. Take me to your world, let me see your face, carry me away.
Hello and welcome to another SDA Q&A. I'm your host, for today. Peter Dixon, back for a part 2 with my special guest, Ronald Lawson. How are you today, Ron?
Pretty good. Thank you, Peter. Yes, well prepared, I think, and excited to be here.
That's great. Great to have you. I really enjoyed our conversation last week. And I realised then that we could do a 10-part series of interviews just with you, Ron. You've been there at every key point that in the last, post QOD Adventist era, and you're a wealth of information, and it's really a pleasure to have you to share your stories.
Thank you.
Now, this is season 3, episode 33, the final of our series here, where we've focused on the LGBTQIA plus community, demonstrating that we want to learn more about the community, the struggles, the stories, and that we welcome to the SDAQ&A table everybody from the community, those that are allies, those that disagree even. We're having a conversation, we're learning, we're educating each other, but most of all, we're keeping that idea of loving one another, being kind to one another, and refraining from judging one another as much as possible. So thank you for being the final interviewee of this season. And it's been a terrific journey. I've really enjoyed it. I think some have asked me where the first 15 episodes are on YouTube. They are available at the moment over at SDAQ&A, our Facebook group, but I'm slowly uploading them to YouTube as well. People have asked also if they can support what I'm doing. So let me bring that up on the screen here. If you're enjoying my content and would like to support what I'm doing, you can go to paypal.me/Peter Dixon Music. And look, even if you just dropped in a price of a cup of coffee, that would be greatly appreciated, because I'm spending a lot of my time offering up social media content, and I'm enjoying it, but it has become my job, really. So COVID sort of slowed and stopped the music realm that I was once a part of, and so I appreciate your support. Now, from a sociologist or sociological perspective, Ron, because you've done a lot of study in that area, can you tell us just briefly, and I know you haven't watched all the episodes in this season, but from a sociological perspective, what does it look like? What does this cluster of episodes and interviews come across as from a sociological perspective? I'm throwing you on the spot there a little bit. We hadn't planned that question, but just if you could kind of give us some thoughts on that.
Well, I'm embarrassed because I haven't really been watching them at all, because I've been writing, and
Yeah.
I'm very much aware of time pressure for me.
You've been a bit unwell too.
Yes,
So,
yes.
yeah, yeah.
So I really, I mean, I can um, the just as the Adventist Church is a fascinating story to look at sociologically, and you get all sorts of new insights by doing that. Similarly, by looking at the gay Adventists within the Adventist Church, that itself is a real interesting node. And I've written a whole lot about that myself. Um, I would particularly emphasize 2 papers that have come out recently on Spectrum. One came out in the last issue of 2020, which was about the Adventist Church and its LGBTQ members. And then about the last 2 or 3 weeks ago, and still available on the website, but you've got to search under my name now, is the story of the enormous change at Loma Linda University in the last 10, 15 years, from being gay-hating to being a welcoming
Really?
university.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. I would have thought they would have always been a little bit supportive.
No, they were very unsupportive originally.
Right. That's interesting. Maybe because we're going to get you back in next season to chat about some of the sociological perspectives within Adventism. We're going to invite Rick Ferray on as well to share some of his views from that perspective. Might be able to get a panel together and we can talk about looking back at this season and kind of draw out some ideas. But look, let's get straight into it and welcome everybody that has joined us. I wanted to chat to you a little bit. We left off just when I was going to get into an interesting question about your comparison of Mormons and SDAs and JWs, and we will come to that in a moment. I promised everyone we would do that. There was a lot of interest in that. But I wanted to talk about how you came to launch your research, I guess. Tell us a little bit about what you've done, what is yet to be done, and what worries you given your age. I still think you come across as sprightly and alert, but you did mention you're 82. So does that play into this factor of the researcher?
Yes, it's what gives me a sense of urgency, of pressure. But let me take those questions in order. I mentioned last week that I did honours in history as an undergrad.
Hey, sorry, Ron. We've just had a message. We just need to take your mic away from your face again. I'll say it right now as we start, so we don't have to interrupt the
Say
flow.
that again. Take it away from my face.
Yeah, away from your face a little bit. Try
Okay,
that.
is that better?
Yes. Try taking it down away from your nose and down. Yeah, try that.
What about now?
And just count to 5.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that's right. And if those that are watching, thanks, Adrian, for that. If you could just give us another little sound check in a minute or two.
Yes,
sorry, Ron. Away you go.
Okay, so I was at the University of Queensland. I'd done honours in history. I started to do a PhD in history, and then I discovered sociology. I'd not done any as an undergrad. I had to go back and take some courses and get up to grade. But I persuaded the university to let me do my PhD in both disciplines. And one of my first sociology courses was on the sociology of religion. And for me, it was an absolute eye-opener because as an Adventist who had been raised very much in the church, I gained a whole new understanding of what Adventism was about by thinking about it sociologically. And I said to myself, I've got to share this with fellow church members. I even thought about doing my dissertation on that topic, but my supervisor didn't like that idea at all, and you don't offend your supervisors. So I chose a different topic, and away we went. But I always kept in mind, because I remained involved in the church, and especially in the interesting part of the church, during my years in New York, which was from 1971 to 2015, I was a member of a special church. It was an independent congregation, which was also a forum chapter. We met every Sabbath, and once a month we met on Sabbath afternoon as well. And that kept me. I was the president for 41 of those years, which meant I got the speakers. I got the speakers who I wanted to hear, and it kept me really in touch with the issues that I was interested in. And I'd learned a whole lot about Adventism from those 41 years. And then I was finishing the study that I had done on housing issues in New York and tenant movement, fighting landlords and so forth. And in 1983, I had the contract. I came up for tenure. I got tenure, and I was promoted to full professor. So in other words, I'd gotten everything that you can get as an academic as far as rank is concerned. And I was safe. No one could tell me, because I had tenure, no one could get mad with me for studying something which was unexpected. So I then decided to study Adventism, because that's what I'd been wanting to do. And I had a sabbatical leave coming up in the year 1984-85. So I planned to spend that whole year driving around America, which I did. I drove 28,000 miles and doing interviews en route. Near the end of that period, I came to the 1985 General Conference session in New Orleans. I had been planning to do this study of America, but I was amazed at the diversity of the people at the General Conference session, and I saw, as a sociologist, I was really interested in the differences, the different points of view. The most memorable statement that I heard was that an African, who was in fact a delegate from Ghana, but he was a student at Andrews University, a graduate student, got up and he said, the Pope has just appointed African cardinals. When is Adventism going to appoint African cardinals? Mm-hmm. In other words, they were feeling correctly totally unrepresented at the General Conference session, but among the officers and staff of the General Conference. And that led to the appointment of the first African to a minorish role, but he then went on to become the Secretary of the General Conference in another few years, at the next session. So I realized that there were going to be strains with different points of view as the global church became global in its representation, because before that the leaders of all the divisions had been Americans and Europeans, and I realized that there would be strains, as we have seen over the issue of women's ordination since then. And so I realized that if I was going to study anything in Adventism, I could not leave out the world. And I took on this enormous study. So what have I done? I've done interviews, long interviews. They average about 2.5, 3 hours each. The longest one was 19 hours. And I've been in 60 countries at least once, many of them many times, or several times. And I've done more than 4,700 interviews. Now, wow. That is a total madness total, if you're a sociologist.
Incredible.
You have to understand that the unit of analysis is the paragraph or sometimes the sentence.
Yes.
And it just takes an enormous amount of time to process all that data. And that's the problem. I should say that the interviews are absolutely marvelous. I mean, they're magnificent. I promised the people who I interviewed anonymity, and which means I do not cite them. I do not tell people what they've said. And that loosened them up to tell me stuff. They would tell me many times, I'm telling you things that I've never told a visiting person from the General Conference. There's great variety, therefore, in the interviews. It's astonishing how variety came my way. I mean, I knew what I wanted, but it was also who was there when I got there. One problem is that the first 2 years of my study was before laptops. See, my normal way of interviewing, I don't record, because if you record somebody, they become very aware of what they're saying. So I sit there with my laptop these days and type as they talk, and I'm a fast typist, and that works. There's a message, Peter. So I've got about 2,000 interviews that were in handwriting, and I'm still working on getting those into files. I'm using the program Dragon to read them, And I'm the only one who can read my handwriting, so I've just got to keep going with that. And then they've got to be coded, and coding. Peter, I'm not hearing you.
No, go ahead. Go
Okay.
ahead.
The I've got to code them. I've got an enormous coding grid, and I go through the interviews and I code them for where they're going to be useful in the books. I've worked out 4 volumes, 50 chapters, and I still do occasional interviews. Like I was at a celebration of a 90th birthday on Sunday, and I met 2 or 3 people who I arranged to interview as a result. But mostly I'm not doing that because I'm trying to finish. And my problem is that I've got to finish transcribing, I've got to finish the coding, I've got to do the analysis and the writing of 4 volumes. That's a whole lot. Now let me say about my latest event. In December, early December, I had a small pain in my heart. And I almost didn't report it. It seemed to be so slight. Lasted a day or 2. And I thought maybe I should report it. And so I did. And I was sent for an angiogram. And when I did the angiogram, I came out of it with 2 stents. And they'd found 2 of the main arteries from the heart blocked.
Wow.
Or one was 99% blocked and the other 80%.
Wow.
And I was told point blank that if I hadn't reported this and gone and got the stents, I would have had a heart attack.
Wow.
So these things can happen, and so that experience, and then turning 82 in January, made me somehow urgent and worried about, would I die and my stuff be lost with me? I mean, I can always leave the interviews to the Heritage Room or the Wright Library at Andrews. But the people who would use them for dissertations according to their own interests,
Yes.
and my stuff wouldn't come out.
Yeah.
So I sought some advice. I have a mentor who's now 93, who was the person who sort of led me from political sociology into religious sociology, and he basically said, why don't you write a summary of what each chapter is going to be, so that if you have to give away your data, people will at least know what you're trying to do. And then I talked to my sister, who's a very famous editor in Canada. She's actually had an honorary doctorate because she's so good at taking bad manuscripts by academics and turning them into something good.
Wow.
I said to her, what should I do? And she said, why don't you try to find a collaborator who can work with you and then take over should the worst happen? And so within that very day, I sent out about 6 or 8 letters to academic friends, academic Adventist friends, saying, do you know anybody? And the result is that I've got 3 people interested, but they're all busy. And I'm busily working right now, I was until half an hour ago, on the summaries of each chapter. I'm on the first chapter of the 4th volume today, and the idea is to send these to the people so they get a sense of what they're letting themselves in for, and whether they're interested and whether they support the point of view that I'm putting forward. I am still open to. Let me say this because people are going to be watching this. I'm still looking for people because they all seem to think that a team is very good. Let's have somebody to do each volume or something like that. And I don't know that the 3 will actually sign up. So I'm looking for others if they're if they're interested in doing this and they've got the skills. I'm also looking for people who can help with the coding. They don't have to have PhDs to do coding. If they're interested in seeing these interviews and making sense of them, it would have to be done seriously. So following what I needed to be done. But again, I'm looking for those sort of people to help. Got no money, so this is and something to do out of love. An academic, of course, can get credit for publishing if they do it. Finally, let me mention on this topic the themes of the volume, so you sort of have a sense of what I'm doing. I'm going to talk, if we get to it today, about the theme of the first volume, which is basically what I really got into my spirit in that first sociology class, which talked about in part the course, but what struck me was the movement from sect to denomination. And I see this is very relevant to understanding the trajectory of Adventism, though it's had its ups and downs, and we're a real mixed crew. So we're certainly not a denomination yet, but I'll talk about that later tonight, perhaps. The second volume looks at Adventism and social issues. It looks at such things as women, race, both in America and in South Africa. I chose those two to look at. Divorce and remarriage. I'm not going to remember them all. The births out of wedlock, which is a huge issue around the world. They tend to just disfellowship us when it happens, and abuse, sexual and physical abuse within the church, within the families, and people with power in the church, and polygamy in Africa in particular, also Papua New Guinea, and then LGBTQ issues, and finally the Adventism and HIV/AIDS. So those are the chapters being covered in the issues being covered in that volume. The third volume focuses especially on the rest of the world, on the ongoing global. It begins with looking at strategies for spreading the message and how these have developed over time, what sort of effect they have. I should make it clear that when I do this, the reason why certain people at the General Conference are scared of what I'm doing is they can't control me. I can tell the truth without it, and my job is not in doubt as a result of what I might write. Actually, the first time I went to the General Conference, Neil Wilson was asked who I was, because it was the first time I was there. I was unknown, and he knew me from kinship, and from the foundation of kinship, and so he said that, and he said, "But don't be worried." He said, "My advice to you is to do honest interviews with him. Tell him what he needs. But if he writes stuff that we don't like, we will know what to do."
Really?
Yes.
Who was he saying that to?
So to people in the General Conference who asked him who I was.
Says a lot, doesn't it?
Yes. So first of all, I look at what strategies have been used, and then I look at the stuff on the Mormons and Witnesses and Adventists. I look at growth, the spread of Adventism and of the others, but comparing them, how reliable the statistics are, and then I've published a number of articles and done a lot of work on immigrants coming from the developing world to the developed world, and especially it started with Britain and France, and then to the Netherlands and Europe. Those three countries in particular I've focused on, the United States, I did a lot of work on this when I lived in New York because immigrants were flooding to New York. The church in New York is an immigrant church, and as is the church in Britain, and the and in Canada. And Canada is very much an immigrant church now, especially in Ontario and in Quebec. And then I go on to how this has affected the government of the church. Having all this diversity, how this is especially what happened when the colonial nations stopped being colonies, and then they found that they had all these churches with white leaders, and some of these countries said, we're not going to have a church with white leaders. If you want to operate, you've got to have a black leader. And we hadn't trained anybody for those positions, and we had to do a real rush job. And so I go through all that stuff and how it's gone on to impact the church, and then I spend a chapter on looking at how congregations work around the world, and what the pastors preach on, those sort of things. And finally, that chapter ends up with the issues that have come out of being, especially the women's ordination issue, out of the diversity and the diverse membership, the diverse group of delegates at the General Conference session. So that's what the third volume is about. And then the fourth volume looks at, first of all, how, you see, each of this looks at change over time, right? And so I've looked at change over time in how gays are responded to, for example, okay? And you heard me talk about that last week. So that's how the second volume works with that. The whole of the first volume is about that. And the third volume looks about the changes as the church globalizes. And then the fourth volume looks at the impact on beliefs as time passes and as the membership gets educated, and as you get people from different cultures coming in. And then after spending several chapters on several key issues of debate within Adventism, I then go on to things like the financial system of the church, to what extent we're keeping our membership or losing it, and then what's Adventism all about? What's it like being an Adventist? What are we interested in anything but preparing people for for the return of Jesus? Does it matter the dismal state that the world is in, or do we just rejoice over that? And then eventually I come to an assessment of the Ted Wilson regime, and because he tried to bring the church back from being more of a denomination back to being more sectarian. And then finally I say, where is the church going from here? Is it going to continue to grow? And the fourth paper, which you haven't heard of, on Mormons, Witnesses and Adventism, is looking at growth trends, and the growth trends are not looking up. The Adventism is still growing, but it's not growing nearly as fast as it was. So that's what my 4 volumes are about.
Yeah, look, that is fascinating, and I'm eager to be able to have those 4 volumes in my hand at some stage. So I'm getting aware of this urgency that you're talking about, and so anyone that is watching that might like to help Ron with this project, just let us know in the comments or write to Ron personally, because
you can write me, for example, through my website.
Yeah, yes. So someone watching might like to just share the link again to Ron's website there, and we'll add it in the link later. We'll add it in the post later as well.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit more about being a gay researcher abroad?
Yes, I think that becomes a very interesting question, and I've written a paper about it, which is going to go into the book. When I did interviews, I rarely found a reason to tell anyone that I was gay. I mean, why would I wave a red flag and maybe destroy the interview? So I didn't.
Mm.
And but I still feared that somebody might find out, and that my whole situation would blow up, especially when I was traveling abroad. Um, I should mention some of the trips that I've been on, just so you know what I've done. And there was that first trip around North America. Then the end of 1985, I started in Mexico. I went to the Caribbean. I went down through Central America. I went to South America, 4 countries in Central America, 4 countries in South America. I went across to Southern Africa, to Zimbabwe and South Africa. And then I went to Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and Fiji. That was one enormous trip.
I
Um,
reckon. And when was this? Give us the time frame of the years that this was happening.
that was done in 1985, 86. It started in
Right.
December of 85.
Right.
And went till August of 86.
And would you plan ahead of time your travel itinerary and who you were going to interview, or did you just
I booked my flights. I decided with advice from friends who knew the world, the church world, where to go. And I mean, for example, Gottfried Oosterwald was the one who advised me on where to go in Latin America. And he was the man who wrote about missions so much. And then I would write to the secretaries of whatever, or the number 2, either in the administration or in the institution, and say I was coming. And it was astonishing how well it worked. I mean, they would meet me at the airport. They would drive me around, or arrange for me to be driven around to interviews as necessary. One person would take me to the next one, or I'd be in one place where I could walk, and in a college, for example. And then I would go on. You know, the whole thing, the itinerary had to be kept to because of the flights. You had to make them in advance.
Yes.
And doing arranging such flights is really quite complex. I had one travel agent who had great fun doing that for me. And then the third big trip was a huge one. It was the largest of all. We started in Kenya, and then went to Uganda, to Rwanda, Burundi, to both East and West Zaire, as it was then. It's now Congo, and then up to Nigeria, to Ghana, to Burkina Faso, to the Sahel, and then I went to London, and did a round trip around Europe, did almost every country in Europe. This was during the Soviet Union's time, near the end. It was in 89, and it was sort of fascinating to be in Europe just before things fell apart, and to be interviewing the leaders of the churches who had sort of collaborated with the regimes in order to survive. And then after we came back to London, flew to India, and then on to Thailand, Singapore, the Philippines, Hong Kong, South Korea, and then back home. So that was another enormous trip. Now, I've also done other trips. For example, I've been back to South Africa and Zimbabwe again. I've done the communist countries in Europe for a second time, including the Ukraine, and I have a real sort of sense of identity with Ukraine. Actually, I went there just after they'd been doing evangelism there, which had been very successful, and they'd started to establish a lot of churches. And when the president of the division, who was an American at that time, knew I was going to the Ukraine, he contacted them, and lo and behold, he arranged for me to preach in the biggest church in Kyiv on the first Sabbath I was there. So I feel like I've and I interviewed a lot of people in
Really?
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I've been backwards and forwards. I've been to Europe several times. Friedenau and I have quite a Friedenau University and I have quite a close relationship. I've ended up speaking there probably 4 or 5 times, and when I've gone there, I've done that's when I've done my immigrant stuff in Europe over time.
Mm.
How that's been changing.
Can I just ask, this was all on your own, off your own bat, though, wasn't it? Out of your own interest,
Yes,
independently done. Did
independently done.
when you contacted the various organisations, the conferences, the secretaries, etc., the second in command, those that were the leaders, did you have to kind of offer some kind of authentication that you were sanctioned in any way?
It was absolutely astonishing. I mean, it could be dangerous from what
Mm.
I saw. I mean, I wasn't dangerous unless they think what I write is dangerous. But um, but what I basically said was, I'm a professor, I'm an Adventist, um, um, and I'm studying the church because I love it, and I want to find out about it, and I think that my stuff will be helpful, and
Mm.
I was welcomed everywhere. It was
Mm.
just amazing. But what I haven't got to is where the topic, the question you've asked me though. So when I was therefore totally dependent on the Adventists where I was. They
Mm.
were the ones who picked me up and took me to the airport. They were the ones who provided me with the bed and with food. Um, the and it was they who helped me arrange interviews. I
Yeah.
would go to the person who I wrote to, and he would help me arrange interviews. Um,
Yeah.
and I always had this fear that somewhere out in the boonies, somewhere, I would something would blow up, and
Yeah.
I would be left by myself and with no one to help me, and that was a genuine fear.
Yeah.
Now it turns out that there were 3 different times when this almost happened. Well, it seemed to happen, but it didn't quite. It's worthwhile telling about these, I think.
Yes.
The first was in South America, so it was in 1986. Um, I had become friendly with a person who I interviewed from the union office in Chile, in Santiago, and he invited me home to have a Sabbath evening meal with his family, and his younger son offered to be my chauffeur going to Valparaiso, for example, and um, and he would tell me that he was waiting in fear because this was the time of the military government of General Pinochet, but he was about to be conscripted,
Mm.
and he was very worried about what would happen to him when he was conscripted, and I tried to encourage him, and we had a good day together, and then when I went from Chile to Argentina and then to Sao Paulo in Brazil, and I heard there from somebody that he'd been conscripted or was about to be conscripted. It was happening, and so I called him to sort of encourage, and he had already gone. But his father, who'd been so helpful to me when I was in Chile, proceeded to call me somebody who'd misled him and lied to him, and I said, well, what's this about? And apparently the president of the union in Chile had been at a meeting at the division headquarters in Brasilia, and they'd all had the secretaries had of several countries had letters from me saying I was coming, and they had asked somebody from the General Conference who I'd never heard of and certainly hadn't met who I was, and the only thing he knew about me was that I was a gay activist. Um, and um, um, and he advised being very careful about what they would tell me. So that's why this man was really upset with me. He was a really conservative Chilean Adventist, and I then started to wait for the other shoe to fall and for things to go wrong.
Yeah.
And but nothing happened in Sao Paulo. I went from Sao Paulo to Manaus up on the Amazon, and there was an American missionary who met me at the airport, and he helped me while I was there, and I did my interviews there. And this was a mission in the Amazon, and so very different from Sao Paulo. And then when he was taking me to the airport, he wanted to know, what is this business about me being a gay Adventist? So he'd known, but he hadn't said anything until that point. And he said that the secretary of the division had warned the presidents, including the man who I'd interviewed in Manaus, one of the people I'd interviewed in Manaus, to be very careful about what they said to me, and told them that I was gay. But they'd interviewed me and nothing had happened. And the interviews had seemed perfectly fine to me. And but I got very nervous during that flight about because I'd written to the secretary of that division, so I was flying to Brasilia, so therefore to the division headquarters. And I saw him, and everything went as normal. And I arranged interviews with people. I interviewed him. Good interview. And then I asked him at the end, what is this I hear that you suggested to the president in Manaus that he should be very careful about being interviewed by me? And that led to a 2-hour discussion about being a gay Adventist back in 1986. At the end of that 2 hours, this was a really conservative man. He went on from there to be a secretary in the General Conference, one of the associate secretaries, and got a reputation for being really conservative in that position. But he at the end, he said, I thank you for sharing with me, and my understanding of gay people has been improved greatly because I've never talked to one before. So nothing happened. It seemed about to blow up, but it didn't. And that was my last country in South America. I'd already been in Peru and Chile and Argentina, and nothing had happened there either. That was a miss. Plenty happened interview-wise. Okay, the second time happened actually in Australia. It's because I went on that year, you'll remember, first of all, to the Southern African countries, and then I flew to Perth, and I interviewed in Perth, Adelaide, Melbourne, and then Sydney, and then was heading north, and Canberra as well. And I interviewed lots of people in at the division and the union. And one of the interviews that I had was with the president of the union, and he'd had a reputation for being a very nasty president during the few years before that, after Glacier View, where he'd fired a number of pastors in the Queensland Conference, which he was president of at that time, and I think in some other conference. I don't remember the whole thing now, and I was asking him these tough questions, but he kept the door open between me and his secretary, so that she could hear everything, and I found that really odd. I almost said, "What's going on?" but I didn't. I just finished the interview. And then I went on from, finished interviews in Sydney, conference level, division level, um, um, the union level. And then I went to Avondale, and the president was away, the principal was away, and I was interviewed initially, but he was the person I would have contacted anyway, by the provost. And we arranged everything. I interviewed him. He told me that I was going to be staying with his wife and him in their house. And then he said, "There's one thing I need to tell you." He said, "We received a letter that was sent out to both Avondale and to all the conferences from the union president, saying that we should not let you interview us because you are a gay activist." He said, "Then we had a faculty meeting about this, and we decided you were an academic and we were a college, and we were going to treat you like a researcher, and so you're welcome here, and please go ahead with your interviews."
What year was this again?
1986.
Right.
Then I went on to Brisbane, my home city, and lo and behold, the president of the conference there was somebody who I'd known as a youth in the conference, and we had a really good interview, long. And he got very enthusiastic and told me lots of stuff. And then at the end of the interview, he said to me, "I have to tell you that I received word that was crazy." He said, "I now realize that it's crazy. It's misinformation that I was given." He said, "But I had told the pastors at a pastors meeting that they shouldn't be interviewed by you. But if you tell me if we can work out who you want to interview, I'll tell them to go ahead." So again, everywhere around Australia where it looked like things would explode, it didn't. The third incident, well, series of incidents, happened in the 1989 trip, which you'll remember took me across Africa and then around Europe and then to Asia. And when I got to Thailand, I stayed first of all at the hospital in Bangkok, and then I stayed at the mission. And I realized that the president of the mission was the father of a kinship member. And I knew from the kinship member that he'd had trouble with his father. His father had been very unaccepting. So I interviewed him and everything went fine, and I did my interviews around the mission, the people who I wanted to interview there. And on Sabbath morning, I'd arranged to be driven to the college. And we had to do an early start. And we were just getting ready to board the vehicle that we were going in when this president came rushing into the room. He said, "Are you the president of Kinship?" It's astonishing how often I've been known as the president of Kinship, and I've never been. And I said, "No, but I'm a member of Kinship." So I wasn't going to lie to him. And he said, "But I can have nothing more to do with you." But he didn't tell me to leave. I went back to the college, did my interviews at the college, came back and spent another night at the mission. And while I was there, I had a question for him. And I chased him down and I asked him a question and he answered it. And then I went on from Bangkok to Singapore, which was at that stage the headquarters of the Far Eastern Division. And I did interviews first of all at the division itself. Interviewed for 2 or 3 days there. And then I went out and interviewed pastors, etc. And I also went to, and I interviewed the president of the Union Conference for Southeast Asia, which was, I can't remember whether it was in southern Malaysia or whether it was actually in Singapore. I can't, but it was there close by. And he'd heard, I did the interview. And then at the end of the interview, he told me that he'd heard from the guy in Thailand that I was gay, and wanted to know about it. And we had this long conversation, which seemed to be fine, except that when I got back to the division headquarters, which is where I was staying, there was a message to come to the president's office, and he'd told the president, who I'd already interviewed, remember? And we talked, and at length, and I apparently made him quite happy with me. But he said, I have got to, because I'm the president of the division, let the union presidents know then about you before you get there. Now, that was pretty scary thing for me, but that's what he did. Now, what I haven't told you is that particular trip, I had 2 people with me. It was the only time I traveled with anybody else. But I'd had a friend who was a chemist. He'd done a bachelor's, BSc, and was an industrial chemist. And he got bored with it. But from knowing me at the Forum Church in New York, he was thinking of doing sociology. And he asked me if he could come on the trip with me and to find out whether he really wanted to be a sociologist. So he shared the interviews with me on that trip. And I also had a new partner for only 6 months, met him only 6 months before I had to leave. And of course, the trip was arranged before I met Scott. And it was I was head over heels with this guy. And we were in fact going to be together for 24 years, but I nearly lost him because I left for 9 months. And I realized that was happening. He'd left where we lived, stopped living in my house, and went off to San Francisco. And then he couldn't bear being alone in the house without me. And so I decided to take a break when I finished Africa before I went to London. And I flew to New York, and then I flew to San Francisco, and I saw him. I said, would you like to come with me? I've already got Obed with me. Well, why don't you be the person? You don't do interviews, but you can do arrangements, because we're taking trains over Europe. And so he came, and so he was there, and he was there in Asia as well. And so there were 3 bearded men together. And here we arrived at the Philippines, and they were having some sort of meeting of all the pastors. So they didn't have any room for me. And they just sent me to a hotel where I had to pay for myself for once. And I thought that they were giving me the cold shoulder. But it was not true, because the next morning when I went to the union headquarters, the president came out of the union and did a 3-hour interview with me. And but as we traveled, no one ever said anything to me. But when Obed was doing interviews, he was asked about us being gay, or about me being gay. And he would say he was gay too. So they became aware that we were 3 gay men traveling together. And the rumors went round. And I eventually went to the college, and the rumors had gone around the college that these 3 fairies were coming, and the Filipinos seem to assume that gays are very effeminate, so that when they saw 3 bearded men, they said, "What we've been told is wrong." So there was there was no problems in the Philippines. I flew from the northern Philippines to the southern Philippines Union, and I was met. And when I got there, I was scared. I didn't know what was going to happen there either, because all the union presidents had been contacted. And the president said to me, "Oh," and we arrived in the late afternoon. He said, "I've arranged for you to speak at worship tonight." So I thought that was a good sign. And when you travel among Adventists, you've got to have a sermon up
Yeah,
in your pocket.
yeah.
Um, and so nothing happened there, and then nothing happened in the other two unions that I went to in Hong Kong and South
Mm,
Korea.
mm,
So again, it looked like these were all in situations where it looked like things were going to blow up,
mm.
um, but where they didn't.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And they seem to be almost inadvertently advertising and promoting you by going ahead and saying, here comes the three wise men of the gay set, and and instead of creating havoc, it kind of created interest in some ways.
Yes, well, it certainly created curiosity. the
Yeah,
It was quite a remarkable experience, the whole thing.
yeah,
Everywhere I went was. I must say that traveling to do these interviews
mm,
was a really excellent experience.
yeah,
And I mean, because I said I was an Adventist, because I could speak the Adventist lingo, because I knew so much about the church,
mm.
I was instantly accepted.
And being a professor is well respected and authenticates what you're doing as well.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so I got a sense um, of the brotherhood and sisterhood,
Mm,
of the Adventist church from
mm,
this. While at the same time, I knew that these people's ideas were very often very different from mine.
yeah.
That they were often very conservative compared to my. If you become a sociologist, your mind opens up to all sorts of things. So
Mm, mm.
to different understandings.
That's right. And you
And
see systems at play that are predictable more than individuals being
yes,
of
yes,
concern. You see the
yes,
bigger picture.
yes.
In talking about the bigger picture, you haven't just focused on Adventism. Can we move to the question of the Mormons and the JWs? Unless there was something else you wanted to add to what you were just talking about.
No, I think that is fine. But can I take a break for a minute?
Certainly. You go and do that. I'm going to put a little sign up here. Where's it gone? Oh, it's already there. So, everyone, because we're having a nice 2 hour interview today, I said to Ron that in the middle we can have a short break. And I've got a very professional graphic that I'm bringing up for you. We'll be back in 5 minutes, everybody. Feel free to ask any questions in the meantime. See you soon. go. Just while we're waiting for a couple of others who also took the opportunity to have a little break, just want to give myself a little plug there. In the background, I've got a bunch of CDs. That represents 40 years of recording there.
Really?
And it's
And that's your music?
that's my music.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got a collection of CDs and recordings I've done since 1982.
Well, the music that you played at the beginning, was that your music?
That's one of my songs as well, yes.
Okay.
And where I was going with that is that this is 40 years now since the first recording, and so I'm putting a what would we call an anniversary collection together of 40 songs from that. So I just noticed them sitting there in the background, and that's going to hopefully be available in April. Because get this, 40 years ago, come April, I recorded my first album right here in the next room, not even realizing that one day I would buy this house and this is where I'd be living. It was when I was, 19, 20, whatever, and there it was. And one day I just sat here and I thought, hang on, that's where I recorded the first album. So, so I'm having fun putting together, selecting 40 songs from over 300 songs, and I'll put together a collection, make available if anyone's interested. So, right, everyone looks like they're back now. Welcome back, everybody. This is part 2 of part 2, and it's great to have Ron Lawson here with us. And we're just about to start an interesting conversation on Mormons, SDAs, and JWs. You've published several papers comparing Mormons, SDAs, and JWs, the different patterns of global spread, total growth trajectories, who joins each, who stays, who leaves. I'm fascinated about this. Can you share us some insights onto these topics that you've explored?
Sure, I'd love to. I thought that it was really important to be able to compare Adventists with other groups that started in America in the 19th century, that were sectarian, just like the way we were. And that means in high tension with society, which are different levels of the move from sect towards denomination. And they've all attempted to be global. I would like to have included the Pentecostals as well, because they were formed at the very end of the 19th century. But they're congregationally organized, and they've split into so many groups that it's really impossible to get statistics from them that make any sense. And but I can tell you that just to be a dampener, I suppose, that the Pentecostals are each year in the world baptizing as many members as the Adventist Church has in total. Pentecostalism is being an amazing success, especially in the developing world, or parts of the developing world. Mm-hmm. But I will stay away from that and work at what I call the MAW groups, the MAW groups, the Mormons, Adventists, and Witnesses. That's the order in which they were founded.
Yeah.
But I'm going to give you the data that I'm going to. Now, I don't usually deal with a lot of data, but this is one. There's 3 chapters here, which are based on these 3 papers that I've written. And there'll be a 4th paper at the very end, which is being finished off about the future, about where we're going. And and this is based on statistics, of course. And so I think it's worthwhile saying a little bit. I don't have anything to show you, so I will keep this very simple and just give you a couple of examples. The first question is to ask, who are they counting? Because the 3 groups don't count the same people. So you've got to bear that in mind. Adventists can count only baptized members at whatever age they allow in different parts of the world for them to be baptized. Mormons count also the children who have been dedicated. And then they've got to be registered when they turn 8. 8 is for them, for the Mormons, when they reach majority somehow. And and if they're not registered, then dropped. But the kids who were dedicated between birth and 8 years of age are counted as part of the membership. So that inflates them somewhat compared to what Adventists do.
Yeah.
Witnesses do the reverse. They don't count baptisms. They count publishers. And by publishers, they mean the people who go out door knocking.
Wow.
That's who they count. So I had to come up with some sort of way of equalizing this. And let's come first of all to just the straight statistics. So you've just got to bear in mind that these are weighed somewhat differently. I should tell you that Mormons were the largest because they started first. They started 20 years ahead of Adventists. But in the late 1990s, the total number of Adventists surpassed the total number of official members of the Mormon Church, or the Church of the Latter-day Saints. Witnesses, of course, because of the way they count, are very much smaller. But I was going to try to work that out. But that tells you something about the growth. Let me mention also about baptisms. I added this up for one of my papers for the 5 years between 2004-2008. So it's getting 10 years ago now, more, 15 years ago. In those 5 years, Mormons had baptized 1.3 million. Witnesses had baptized 1.3 million. Adventists had baptized 5.2 million.
Wow.
Adventists were just growing much faster. But of course, we're not growing as fast as we should be if we were keeping all of those. It means that we're really losing a good bunch, and especially of the new converts and of the youth these days.
What are the stats on that? I've heard that the youth leaving is as high as 60%, and those that come into the church as high as 50% leave within a few years.
There's good guesses at this. Yes, I've been hearing those sort of statistics too. I think that the losses are lower than that for those who've been converted, but they're still pretty great.
Okay.
And well, I'll come to this in a little bit. So let's wait on that one. Okay.
Yep.
Let's now come to the spread. Okay. So remember, they are each globalizing. So how are they going with this? It's interesting where they are concentrated mostly. The Mormons, of course, are concentrated hugely in North America. As a matter of fact, more than half their membership is still in the United States. The witnesses have done much better in Europe than anywhere else. I mean, it's just shocking how well the witnesses have done in Europe, and Adventists haven't. The Adventists have done best by far in the developing world, in Africa and Latin America in particular. Let me tell you something about we did some statistics on gross national in their concentration in countries with high, medium, or low gross national income. So this is the combination of the mean national income of the mean income of the countries, and the high income countries, the Mormons have 53% of their members there. The Witnesses have 39% of their membership there. And the Adventists have less than 10% of their membership there.
Wow.
Let's look at the low income countries. The Mormons have 2% of their membership there. They really haven't done well at all in the developing world. Where am I? The Witnesses have got 16% of their membership there, and the Adventists have got 47% of their membership there.
Wow, that explains
So we have
a lot.
We're concentrated in the poor countries, and we tend to attract poor people. I will get to a piece on that too. Now let me come to Mexico, which has the most interesting census, because it gives the most detail where you can put the religion and run it by various variables. So let me tell you just two of what I've found. I've written a whole paper on Mexico. Let's look at the educational levels. I'm going to count together those with no education and some elementary education. They haven't finished grade school. In Mexico, 26% of the Mormons, 36% of the Witnesses, 48% of the Adventists are in that category. What about those who graduated high school? I'm not giving, it's worse with the university graduates, but the high school graduates. Mormons, 25%. Witnesses, 13%. Adventists, 10%. What about income? This is the average percentage of the membership compared with the mean income of the country. The percentage for the Mormons is 158%. So the average Mormon earns 1.5 times the mean income in Mexico. It means they're not keeping their poor people. They're baptizing a lot of people, but they're not keeping the poor ones. In the case of the Witnesses, 32%. Oh, no, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. 88%. So a bit below the mean. The average income for Adventists, 50% of the mean. We've got an enormous number of poor people. And the odd thing is that we've got 3 universities there. The others don't run a university there, of course. And because our people are poor, they have huge costs and issues about attending our schools. So the membership that is poor and rural in the Southeast is very poor, very rural. 24% of the Mormons are there. 32% of the Witnesses are there. 78% of the Adventists are concentrated there. And that's so often the story. We go and plant our missions somewhere in the boondocks, and we win the poor people. Some of whom rise because of our educational opportunities, but it takes a good while if you're that poor. The Mormons are concentrated in Mexico City. The Witnesses, a mix between urban and rural. Last paper that I did was on the reliability of the data. As we did this work, By the way, I did this work not alone. I did it with two others. One, a Mormon who lost his faith while he was being a Mormon missionary and came back and did a PhD in sociology. And a guy who's, remember that witnesses are discouraged very much from education. So the person who I found to be a witness is married to a witness, and who has 3 children, 2 of whom have high positions in the Jehovah's Witness, in the Watchtower organization. I came to suspect the accuracy of the official membership data for everybody, and obviously the witness one was, because of the way they count, was not very, very suitable. And I wanted to see what the real membership was. The Adventists in the developing world often report absolutely absurdly low numbers of deaths. I mean, the Adventist health message is not that good. And it's not being observed much in the developing world anyway. It's just simply that they're not counting the deaths, and they're staying on the rolls. I also have lots of evidence that immigrants who leaves, let's say, Jamaica and come to, well, they've come to New York, they've come to Toronto, they've come to London. They leave their membership in their home church because they expect to go back. But when they come, they also put a membership on a local church, so their membership is counted at least twice. Very often. So I became very concerned about how reliable all the stuff that I was doing was. And so I decided to use census data. We decided to use census data. And then I must say that the genius of this is not me, but my former Mormon friend. And we used every census that reported the membership of any of these 3 groups, and then we combined that, because it was from countries from all over, and we used that to estimate the membership in the other countries, and by comparing the official membership with what the census membership was. Now remember, the census says, what religious group do you identify with? Doesn't mean to say you go to church. It's just, what do you think of yourself as? But it's reliable. It's measuring that. Whereas being a member means is an official member means you haven't been disfellowshipped and you were baptized sometime and haven't been dropped in the Adventist case. So let me tell you what I found. This is using the data for 2009. We decided that the real membership of Mormons was 13.8 million at that point. That the real membership of witnesses was 7.3 million. Oh no, sorry, I'm doing this wrong. Let me start again. According to the rolls, so this is the official membership. The official membership of Mormons was 13.8 million. Our census changes found that they had only 8.4 million. In other words, they have a huge hemorrhage. Huge. The witnesses, who counted only 7.3 million publishers, in fact, have 14 million people who claim to be witnesses, who think of themselves as witnesses, even if they're not publishing.
Yes, interesting.
And the Adventists, because we've been doing some work trying to clean the rolls, are not so bad. So the official membership was 16.3 million, And the membership which we got from the census is 17.6 million. But remember that counts children. The
Yes,
father
yes.
fills out the census report and he lists his kids too, whether they've been baptized or not.
Mm,
So in fact, the Adventist membership should be higher than that
yeah,
compared to the official membership.
yeah.
So it does mean that the membership is not as high as the
No, it's actually lower, but because they've
yes,
included the
yes,
children, it's brought it up.
yes.
What year was that again?
2009.
Okay.
So that's my report to you on the more groups.
Yes, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm just putting up every now and again your website address. Just check I've got
Thank you.
it correct there, because people can go there and find out links and other places to get your research from. And Andrew Skeggs just wrote this comment, which let's hope it adds to the urgency of what you're doing. Love Ronald Lawson's research. I'm so hoping he finishes writing his books on Adventism.
Thank you, Andrew.
I thought this was a good one. David Potter wrote this. He's laughing at the comment on Adventist health message not being that good. A lot of people would not like to hear that. Let's, it's interesting. I was having lunch with someone today who's not an Adventist. They do live in the area, so they know Adventists. And he just randomly, I'd forgotten that we're going to talk a bit about this. And he said, is Adventism still a sect or is it a denomination now? And that's kind of exactly what our next question is. The concept of Adventism from sect to denomination. They're becoming more comfortable with society, but what things might be holding them back from that? From separation to concern for image, etc. Share some of your views on that for us.
Now, this is the theme of the first book, the first volume. Okay, so let me first of all describe what I mean by a sect and what I mean by a denomination. This is from a sociological point of view. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm not putting a value on this. I'm not saying a sect is good or bad and a denomination is good or bad. They're used as descriptive words.
I want to add that I'm not either. It's a descriptive word that is accurate for groups that eventually become denominations. They generally start out as a sect. So
yes.
We're not being critical.
Now, a sect is defined as being in high tension with society. And there's three measures that I use of that. Separation, they're separate, they're different, and that there are, oh dear. Uh-oh. Can I take a call? Because this is...
Yeah, you can do that. Will I just take you out of the thing for a second?
Just for a second.
Just so people don't listen in. So I'm very much enjoying this conversation here with Ron Lawson. Thank you guys for watching. He's just taking a call. I thought he said from his mother there for a second, but I don't think that will be the case. So let's see what someone else is writing on the wall here. David's replied to his comment there. Perhaps I should add that I'm a lifelong vegetarian, raised on SHF products, almost a vegan, and at 73, enjoy the best of health. And Dave, I hear you. I wasn't. We weren't mocking. It just sounded funny if you took it out of context, didn't it? Yeah, I've been a vegetarian all my life, and I'm 94 next month, so I'm doing pretty well. So I think we've got Ronald back.
I'm a vegetarian too, and I think it makes a difference. But what I said was it doesn't stop death.
Exactly. And out of interest, when I put you into the waiting room, can you still hear the conversation? Just a tech thing.
Yes,
good.
Yes, I could hear you.
That's good for me to know.
All right, so a sect is in high tension with society. It's separate, different, and there's mutual antagonism between it and the state, other churches, and society in general over various things. A denomination has comfortable relations with government, and obviously you move from one to the other. It's a continuum. Comfortable relations with other churches and with society. They're integrated. They're not considered strange. So that's the definitions, all right? Early Adventism was highly sectarian. Think about it. They insisted on Sabbath observance when the work week was just 6 days.
Hey, we've just got to move the mic back down again, a little bit away from you.
Sorry, is that better?
That's good.
Their diet kept them separate. Now, I used to live in a neighborhood of New York City, which was half ultra-conservative Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews. And we could never go into their houses. And of course, they couldn't entertain us because we would pollute the place, and we didn't. And the food and the washing and all sorts of stuff like that just kept them ridiculously separate, in my opinion. But Adventists didn't have that sort of effect too.
Sorry, we've just got to move that mic down again. We can't quite hear what you're saying there.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's good.
You want me to repeat?
Sorry, it does have to go down maybe about 1 centimetre or 2, just down and out a little bit. Down and out. Down a tiny little bit. Sorry, we're just fixing that. Yes, I think that's good. So just say that last little bit again.
Okay, so early Adventism was highly sectarian. They wanted to observe the Sabbath in a society where the usual work week was 6 days. It was practically impossible to get a job without it, unless you were a farmer, which is one reason why so many Adventists were farmers, or some sort of artisan controlling your own life. Their diet kept them separate. I was saying that I used to live in a neighborhood in New York which was half ultra-Orthodox Jew, and their diet and they were extremely close-knit and separated. You couldn't. I was never invited into any of my neighbors' houses who were among those of that community. Then our view of our special relationship with God made us different and kept us separate. All these things made us different and kept us separate. Meanwhile, our expectations of persecution from the government and from other churches, and our bold denunciations of them in evangelistic sermons and in our books and magazines, created antagonistic feelings in both ways. Suspicion. You were expecting the end soon, so you were expecting soon persecution. As time passed, and our educational institutions and hospitals were successful in creating upward mobility among our members, we gradually became more comfortable with society, other Christians, and governments. For example, when the Sunday law was introduced to Congress in the 1880s, this was what we were waiting for. After that, Jesus would come, right? But we tried to stop it becoming law. Ellen said, we've got to delay the second coming in order to spread the message further.
It's convenient.
Now, tensions within grew as they relaxed with society outside, because there were differences. Not everybody changed at the same rate. And so people disagreed with each other more than they had before. And it depended on how seriously, perhaps, whether they took the specific comments of Ellen White. Part of the process was the questioning of certain Adventist beliefs and behavioral rules. I want to go off because this is from my generation, and I want to surprise younger people with this story. I grew up not going to the movies. I was an Adventist. I'd been to very few, sneaked away to a few, which turned out to be really sappy movies when I found out about them later. But then when I was in Brisbane, um, in my freshman year at university, the Ten Commandments came. And I figured that that was a suitable movie for an Adventist to go to. So I went with a friend of mine who I was bringing to an evangelistic campaign, actually, every Sunday. And the two of us were lined up at the box on Queen Street. And this was the Regent Theatre, the biggest theatre in Brisbane by far then. And the box was right there on the main street. And I'm lined up to buy my ticket, and someone taps me on the shoulder. And I look around, see somebody who I don't recognize, and he says, "Are you sure you should be here?" And I was embarrassed, and I looked away. And when I looked back, he wasn't there. Now that made me feel really peculiar. And like maybe he was my guardian angel and I was leaving him outside. We went in.
Yeah.
And we're watching the movie. And
what year was this again?
This was 1959.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And halfway through the movie, they're doing their erotic dancing around the golden calf. And a woman the other side of my friend leaned across Ian and touched me on the knee. And she said, "Are you sure you should be here?"
Now, this is not the same person. This is a different...
No, this was a woman.
This is a different... Well, it can't have been an angel because angels stay outside when you go into a theatre.
Yes, well, I mean, I became so convinced that I was being sent a message that I didn't go to another movie for 7 years after that.
Wow.
Now, that's, of course, changed considerably within Adventism.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You might be interested in my explanation of this now.
I would love to know that, because now Adventist young kids going to a movie wouldn't even think twice about it.
Yes.
Whereas my generation was perhaps the transition era. I didn't see my first movie till I was 21, I think.
Well, I think the situation was that I'd come to Brisbane. I was new in Brisbane. I was a freshman. I was going to Central Church, where I'd formed a church choir, which sang every Sabbath, so that I was up there in front of the congregation, a congregation of 500 members, every Sabbath. And these two people were probably people who recognized me from the church, but who I didn't recognize.
Mm.
And obviously the first one was negative about my lining up for the movie. And the second one was probably amused to find herself sitting so close to the choir conductor in her church at a movie. But I didn't think that way at the time.
At the time, no.
So that's my story about the movies. Now
Can I share a quick story about
my
being so that was 1959. So 30 years later, in 1989, I was at a Pink Floyd concert, and there's 60,000 people there, outdoor concert, and the guy in front of me turns around and he's smoking a joint, and he looks at me and says, "You're a Seventh-day Adventist, aren't you?" And I went, yeah. and I said, "How did you know?" And he just went, "You look like one." And then he turned around, and the girl he was with turned around and sheepishly looked at me, and it was the head elder's daughter. And she simply went like this to me.
That's a good story.
Oh, dear. Yeah.
Well, then, so that's what this book is about. It's the volume. It's about how Adventism has moved from being sect-like, the way I just described, gradually towards being a denomination. And I use towards because I don't think we're there yet. And
Mm.
certainly the current administration of the General Conference very much wants us to go in the other direction.
Mm.
Um, the um, the chapters in the book will address the development of the Adventist educational institutions, including their impact on the students and the problems that they're having
Mm.
now with finances, because the numbers are going down in
Mm.
America in particular. Um, it's going to be dealing with the hospitals, the whole medical stuff of Adventist, which are the two core engines together, which have raised meant upward mobility for some Adventists, and education, and therefore a more open attitude to things, progressive Adventists. Um,
Mm.
Chapters, where am I? They'll also discuss the changes in the behavioural norms over time, where the movies is just one example. Adventist relationships with governments, um, which we may talk about tonight.
Yeah, I think I'd like to. We'll get onto that one. I'm interested in that.
And then Adventist relationships with other religious groups. See, there's been changes in all these over time. Um, the in religious groups, we embraced fundamentalism in 1919, and that went on for a long time. And in the 1950s, we embraced conservative evangelicalism. So, and then gradually, in more recent years, we've become interested in having good relationships with Lutherans and Presbyterians, and had talks with them.
Mm.
And we've become more involved with ministers' fraternals and stuff like that.
Mm.
At the same time, we've developed a great, deep concern for our reputation. I'm thinking about such things as panic, that the truth about the connections of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians to Adventism would leak out during that scandal,
Mm.
and create a scandal for us.
Mm.
And can you imagine the Adventist Church trademarked its name?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
You were sharing last week about the scenario, the situation you were involved with during that SDA and the kinship name.
and the last issue that I deal with in that volume is the emergence of ADRA and its
Mm.
impact on our integration into societies.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that's what that volume is about. And that gives you
Mm.
a sense of that from working out the movement from sect towards denomination. But
Yeah.
it remains unfinished because we keep on converting new people. And the new people, the preaching of the evangelists is very much sectarian. Um,
Yeah.
and but meanwhile, once they become Adventists, the second and third generation quite often get educated, and they open up in different ways. And
Mm.
so you have different sorts of churches with different temperaments. You also have divided churches. You have real differences around the world,
Yeah.
um, and all that is going to be looked at
Mm.
in that
That's
body.
It kind of makes it 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And even that friend of mine today, just out of the blue, saying, "Is Adventism still a sect or is it a denomination now?" indicates that your assessment there is right on the money.
Yes.
Look, we'll finish off with this last question. Just we are going to get you back next season to continue as discussing Adventism from a sociological perspective, and I can't wait for that. And we've got a bunch of other topics that we're going to come to with that. In fact, we're probably one of the first questions off the block will be the preserving a good image, e.g., concerning David Koresh. And I had an interesting discussion with a former David Koresh top, what would you not
Lieutenant.
employee? Lieutenant, yeah. Mark Bro, Breault, and he hopefully is going to be on the show next week, and we're going to talk more in depth about his experience with David Koresh. So keep an eye out, everyone, for that. And also Steve Daly is on next week, I think Thursday, 11:30 our time. So that's going to be an interesting discussion. But I thought let's wrap up today and the series. Season 3, episode 33, where we've really focused on the LGBTQIA plus community, wanting to learn more about the issues, hear the stories, create a sense of we value that community. We want to be allies with it. We want to learn more about the clobber texts and all that kind of thing. So we've really dug into that this season. The next season is going to be looking at interviews with former Adventists, sociological perspectives, and we'll return to this topic as well. But I want to thank you for being part of this, the last interview of this season. And we're going to get you to just answer this question. And you've commented Adventists and governments, a preference for dictators. That pricked up my ears. Tell me about what you mean by that. What's the...
This is my paper is called Adventists and Governments, a Preference for Dictators. Now remember that initially we were in America, we were a very small group, and we were expecting to be persecuted by especially the American government, okay? So we had negative attitudes towards them, negative expectations. And indeed, in the democracies of the developed world, Adventists, for the reasons that I've talked about earlier today, because of where our membership's concentrated, we just simply don't have the membership in the countries of the developed world to produce people who are involved in politics. In America, as long as I've been here, we've always had two members of Congress, none in the Senate, but two members of Congress. They're not the same people. They've changed. Initially, for a long time, they were two white Republicans. When I got here, and I mean, there were people before that, but I think one person before that. Then in more recent years, there's been two Democrats instead of two Republicans, and one of those is black, and the other is Hispanic. The black lady is from Houston in Texas, and the Hispanic is not far from Loma Linda, but Loma Linda is not in his district, but he's in a district east of Loma Linda. But basically in the other countries, well, I remember a friend of mine was elected to the Assembly in Queensland, and as far as I know, she's the only Adventist who's ever served in a parliament in Australia. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. And I know of none in Europe. So, in other words, we didn't do well in the developed world where our leadership was ever. And but on the other hand, we did very much better with dictators, especially those who needed to show religious support and were in situations where the other religious groups rejected them. We could stand out by supporting a dictator. Some of us would be embarrassed by the people we supported, but that's what happened. Let me give you some examples, and you'll notice that it changes over time. The first dictator who we had to negotiate with was Stalin.
Wow.
Because Stalin was anti-religion. He certainly, he basically said, if you're going to exist in the Soviet Union, you've got to keep some rules. And the rules included such things as no evangelism, saying that it was part of your religion to serve in the military as regular soldiers, those sorts of things. And we compromised and accepted all that stuff in order to continue to exist.
Wow.
It didn't bring us anything more in the way of real privileges until near the end of the Soviet Union. And near the end of the Soviet Union, especially under Gorbachev, we gained some special advantages by toadying to the Soviets. We got, for example, permission to build a press in Moscow and to build a college in a city about, I think, 40, 50 miles out of Moscow. We had some real advantages gotten that way. And Neil Wilson, when he was General Conference President, went there, and he became a buddy of the member of the government who was in charge of religious groups. His name was Kartchev, and Kartchev was concerned because the various civil rights groups in the United States and Europe were picking up on the story of the breakaway Adventists, the true and free Adventists, who had refused to go along with the compromise. They called themselves true because they did not do the compromising, and free because they didn't serve in the army and things like that.
Mm.
And they suffered greatly. I mean, their leader was in prison for nearly 20 years.
Wow.
In a gulag.
Did
but
he?
the Adventists, because they compromised, that didn't happen to them.
Yeah. When that guy was released, did he ever write anything about his experiences? Is there any information about him out there?
He I'm going to forget the name. When he was in the gulag, he was close to the novel writer who wrote his novels in the gulag, about the gulag.
Was that Leo? Oh,
Not Tolstoy.
No, that's too.
Recently.
That's too old, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue.
Yes, a very famous writer.
Yeah.
I mean, he won a Nobel Prize for Literature, I'm sure. Well, and Neil Wilson gave the remarkable statement, published it in Russia, that Adventists, that the church which the General Conference recognized as the true Adventist church in Russia was the one that was recognized by the government.
Boy.
The same thing happened when the church in Hungary split, and over the same sorts of things. And he went to Hungary and said the same thing there. So he was really keen on having good relationships with regimes.
It's such a fascinating and complex scenario, difficult to judge, because who wants to be in a gulag for 20 years?
Sure, exactly.
And if Neil had said, "Come on, I'm recognizing the true and free guys," he would have sentenced many people to a life of hardship. What are your thoughts on that?
This was under Gorbachev, so things were better by that time.
Oh, okay. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we're all coerced by cause and effect, and if we say something, it's going to have an effect. And I've noticed that play out within this series and others, where if people are worried about losing their jobs, they'll remain quiet. So, but I'm not judging that. I'm saying I can understand why.
So let me now come to the next example chronologically, which is Nazi Germany. If I can use a rude American phrase, Adventists kissed Hitler's ass in order to save their skins. We did a number of embarrassing things, in my opinion. One of the things was that any Adventist who was a Jew, and some Jews had been converted to Adventism, that happens because of the Sabbath, any Jewish Adventist was disfellowshipped. And we did everything to change the focus on that we might be Jews. So we didn't call the Sabbath the Sabbath. We didn't call Sabbath school the Sabbath school during these times. We praised Hitler in our publications. We celebrated his birthday. We gave our welfare organization to the regime and then operated it for them. And then once the war started, there was a Central American division which covered the countries that were controlled by the Nazis. So it expanded and then contracted. And the Central European Division sent out a letter to its members saying that it was permissible for an Adventist to work in a munitions factory on the Sabbath. So, I mean, again, a really difficult situation. If we, the Jehovah's Witnesses refused to go into the army and made a fuss, and they went into the concentration camps. The Reformed Adventists, same thing happened to them.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, I've heard from some people that Adventists reported the Reformed Adventists in order not to be confused with them. The Reformed Adventists had broken away from the Adventist Church in World War I over military service.
Wow, boy. That is mind-blowing, isn't it? I've heard about that, but not in so much detail.
I was actually at a conference in Friedensau in 2014. Yes, it was a conference that was celebrating, remembering the beginning of World War I, 100 years later. And Reformed Adventists were invited to send people to the conference. And they actually had a session where they told about the research, where they'd researched the 1914, etc. situation. And then one night during the conference, they were presented with a letter that had been signed by the presidents of both the unions. There's two unions in Germany, the North and the South. And they signed this letter apologizing to the Reformed Adventists for the ways they were treated in 1914.
Did it help bring about some reconciliation and restoration between the two groups?
No, it didn't. But I mean, they'd gone. When you go on a different path, you come to somewhat different ideas. But but at least there was good fellowship during that time.
They did get together, yeah. And yes. they're still a denomination, aren't they?
Yes.
The Reformed, yeah.
As a matter of fact, I learned from that there's two of them. They've split another time. So there's two Reformed Adventist groups. So let's come now to Eastern Europe, the countries which became part of the Soviet Union after the war. Some very strange situations there. I've done interviews before and after. In other words, during the Soviet Union and after. In most of those countries, the only country that I've missed out on, two. I didn't interview in Albania or in Bulgaria, but in all of the other Eastern European countries, I've been twice and I've interviewed, and got amazing data. Let me tell you about Poland. Poland was a Catholic country, which became communist because of the decision after the war. And the Catholic Church was the main antagonist of the communist government. The communist government couldn't stand the Catholics and
Right.
became really nervous when Pope John Paul II was the Polish Pope, was chosen as Pope.
Mm.
And then he was going to come back to Poland. And the communist government was so nervous. So what happened? I was told when I was there interviewing during the Soviet period, right, that we have been treated so well by the communist government. We had only 4,700 members at the time. But we could publish well, let's put it this way. The paper was rationed and you had to get a permit to publish. And the biggest publications in Poland during those years was, first of all, the writings of Lenin, and second of all, the writings of Ellen White.
Wow.
And we were allowed to publish, to sell our magazines, their equivalent to the Signs of the Times,
Incredible.
in government kiosks in Poland. And we had really, the president of the union was allowed to travel to the West. Poles weren't allowed to travel to the West unless they were considered really good communists. I don't know whether he was a really good communist, but my sense is that you had to be able to really play ball with the communists to be allowed to lead the church. They really chose the leaders of the church in all these countries. The governments did. So that was the situation in Poland. Let's give you one other example. In Romania, I was told some really interesting stuff in Romania. I had a very difficult time there the first time. The president and the secretary made sure that they were the translators for every interview. And that meant that we weren't told much. Obed and I were there on that trip together. And but we found a teacher at the seminary who had got his PhD at Andrews, and who therefore could speak English. And he offered to be interviewed at night when they weren't there, because we were staying at the seminary, and which was also the headquarters building. And he told us a very different story. Now, one of the for example, one of the big issues was that school took place 6 days a week. And if you didn't go to school on the Sabbath, you got into trouble. You got bad marks against you, and you became under surveillance. And I was told that the children of the president had gone to school on Sabbath. But many of the Adventist members in Romania, it's a very conservative church, ran the risk of keeping their kids back every Sabbath. And they greatly resented the fact that the leader didn't set the example. It was interesting. they put the three of us up. I said we were staying in the seminary. It's not true. I now remembered. We were put up in a hotel.
Mm.
And on the last afternoon, we'd finished our interviews, and the train was leaving about 6 o'clock. And we hadn't seen anything. We'd been picked up each day and taken to the seminary, and pastors would be brought in, but then one of the two officers would do the translating, and we were really told precious little. It was one of the reasons I knew I had to go back after the fall of the Soviet Union. And in 1989, I had a laptop with just floppy disks, and the little ones, and the little hard ones, and I'd put all my interviews for Romania on one disk, and Obed must have had another disk, and we each had our computers. And on the last afternoon, we decided we wanted to see something in Bucharest, and we had a couple of hours, so we left our stuff in the hotel room and went walking. And when we came back, we put our stuff together and caught the train. We were on the train heading for Hungary when we realized that the Romanian disks had disappeared from our computers. In other words, the president had reported what to do.
Wow.
To get our stuff. And we had to sit there and spend the night manufacturing the interviews from our memories.
Wow.
Now, it was just as well that we hadn't had too many wonderful interviews, but we had to remember what we were told.
Yeah, boy. So that when you were going through the customs or the check-in or whatever, he'd reported to the authorities, and
they'd come into the room. See, it was a government hotel, communist state.
Yeah, okay.
They just simply come. Officials had come into the room and rubbed us.
Taking the discs. Wow.
Yeah. Fortunately, they didn't take all the discs.
Okay, yeah, and luckily it was fresh in your memory. You could relay the stories to each other and type them fast.
Yes.
I tell you what,
that was a shocking experience for us.
Yeah.
Now let's come to the military dictators. So we come to different parts of the world.
Mm.
I mentioned that in one of my trips took me through South America. I'll tell you stories about. Well, several stories about South America. In Chile, this was the time of General Pinochet's presidency, and it was interesting. The Union Church and the Union officers were clearly very pro-Pinochet. But most of the Adventists elsewhere were very antagonistic to him. So there's a difference between the way the leadership was thinking in this matter and the way the membership was thinking.
Mm.
And the Adventists had a real disadvantage in Chile. Their college was not accredited. And the only way they could make their degrees worth anything was to have their students sit for the exams set by one of the branches of the state university, which meant that they had to shape their courses to those exams, and they couldn't do the real Adventist thing. But one day they had a bright idea. I should say that the college was down south in a town called Chirian, and then out from the town on a dirt road. But somewhere before I had been there, they had arranged for General President Pinochet to come and visit. And they welcomed him. And he came, of course, equipped with television cameras and etc. And there was this welcoming ceremony on outdoors where the president of the college made a speech and then prayed for President Pinochet and announced that God had sent him to save the nation. Now, he'd overthrown an elected president and he'd been killed. But as a result of that, Adventists became known as the Friends of Pinochet.
Wow.
And we got some advantages. You see, the Catholic Church was criticizing him because people were disappearing.
Yeah.
The Adventist Church was praising him.
What year is that again?
I was there in 1986.
Yeah, okay.
But this was earlier. I've actually got photographs taken when he was there with the officials of the college, and he gave the college accreditation, and he gave the college a bitumen road to the campus, and various other advantages. When I was in Argentina, they'd just gotten rid of the generals, and they had a democracy very fresh. And the church leaders complained to me that they said they preferred the generals to the democracy because under the democracy, the unions got active, and there was talk of strikes and stuff like that, and they had so much order under the generals. They also told me, when I asked them about disappearances, the response was, no Adventist disappeared. Now, what they meant by that was that the real Adventists liked the government, and they didn't do anything to attract attention. But there were Adventist youth who disappeared. And they weren't considered real Adventists.
What a world, eh?
I could tell similar stories about Brazil, but I won't. Let me come to Guatemala. When I was met at the airport in Guatemala City, I was taken to the mission headquarters, and I was amazed at the quality of the buildings and the posh neighborhood that they were set in. The Guatemalans are mostly really poor people, and the Adventists are mostly really poor people. But the Adventists headquarters was in this very posh neighborhood. But I eventually put together a really interesting story, and I was told about it in part by the president of the union, the Central American Union, Robert Falkenberg.
Wow.
Who went on to be General Conference president.
Yeah.
Now, I didn't interview him there. I interviewed him at a General Conference meeting, but before he was president. And at a General Conference session. Falkenberg, was born in Central America to missionary parents. He was absolutely fluent in Spanish, and he was very political, and he struck up a really close relationship with the general who was the dictator of Guatemala. And this happens to have been the most bloodthirsty of all the dictators, wow. I was told. Falkenberg boasted to me that he did so much for the he described it as the reputation of the Adventist Church with the government, that he could go to the the president's residence at any time, and that when he was called from there to the division, to the IAD division headquarters in Florida, he was given a farewell reception, and he was the first Protestant to ever have that sort of farewell. But the weird thing was that very shortly after he left, the Central American Union got up and it moved from Guatemala to Costa Rica. And what had happened was that the Adventists, the poor Adventists, who were rebellious to the dictatorship, the military dictatorship, had apparently written threatening them. They were so angry with the alliance of the leadership with the general, and the Adventists took fright, and they moved to another country just to be out of there. And that's how the Union building became the Mission building. Now, understand that Guatemala City is built on a volcano, and there's been terrible volcanic thing shortly, not long before I was there, in '86. And the poor people live on the slopes of the hills in hovels. But then at the top, the flat part, were the rich people's houses, and that's where the Union headquarters was built. So I found that a really disturbing story to have heard.
Yeah, very, very disturbing. It's like a political survival machine. Perfect storm.
Now, let me tell you one other military dictator, President Marcos in the Philippines.
Mm.
Adventists were very close to President Marcos. Well, shall we say we loved him because his grandmother was an Adventist.
Oh,
and
wow.
He went to Sabbath school when he was a kid. And we somehow wished that some of that had rubbed off. And when the revolution took place and he had to flee, and Imelda, no, not Imelda Marcos, the woman who took his place, won the election after he'd fled. I'm not remembering her name. She was a Catholic and very close to the Cardinal in Manila. Of course, Catholics are strong in the Philippines. And so we felt that Marcos was our man, and that when the revolution took place and he was thrown out, that this was Satan at work.
Where are you? This is drawn from your interviews, and
Yes.
people are saying this to you.
Yes, I've had this. I've had this told me.
Yeah. Wow.
And not just once. Once I know about it, once I get a lead, I then proceed to ask questions.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Mind blowing.
Finally, when it comes to Adventists and governments, let me come to the governments in the developing world, because that's where our membership is concentrated. And suddenly we discovered that Adventists can be elected. And we've reached high positions. And I've interviewed the people who've reached high positions. In particular, the two countries where we've reached the very highest positions are Jamaica and Papua New Guinea. We've now got an Adventist president in Zambia too. But there's some question about to what extent is he an ardent Adventist. But let us say that in Jamaica, for example, the previous government had to appoint a new Governor General, the representative of the Queen, the head of state. And he chose the president of the Adventist Union in Jamaica as the Governor General.
Mm.
Now just think on the significance of that, of what that means to that society. It means that Adventists are really up there.
Amazing.
And the current Prime Minister, who's been Prime Minister, this is his second time as Prime Minister, but this time he's been Prime Minister for, I think, since 2017, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong on that date, but it's 4 or 5 years. He is an Adventist, and again a devout Adventist. And I've interviewed ministers of the government who are Adventists, and Jamaica's a pretty poor country. Their economy is really quite poor, and yet here are Adventists in these positions. Well, let me come to PNG, and then I'll talk about what they told me when I interviewed them. Similarly, in Papua New Guinea, these days, the Prime Minister is an Adventist, unless he's changed very recently. And apparently he's considered a good Adventist rather than a skin SDA, as the ones who sort of are seen as not being, using their connections but not really being very devout, are called. I was actually at a meeting in Port Moresby in 1986, which I was invited to by the division, South Pacific Division, because they were having their first meeting with the Adventist politicians. Suddenly they realized that Adventists were being elected to office. And because in those days there was both the national government, national parliament, but also there were provincial parliaments. There were a lot of Adventists involved in politics. And I got the opportunity to interview a lot of them during those days when they were together. There's an interesting story which will come up in a different topic about that. But let me, for the moment, keep on to what these people who I've interviewed. People who, in that time, I interviewed the Deputy Prime Minister, who was an Adventist and considered not a skin, a real one, and some other ministers, and other members of Parliament, and of the provincial assemblies. And similarly, I interviewed in Jamaica members of the cabinet, several, 3 of them, and that was before I was there, before the Adventists became Prime Minister. One question that I asked them all was, and this is true for anyone involved in politics who I've interviewed, what difference does being an Adventist, what difference has this made to the policies you have pursued?
Good question.
And without exception, those who I've interviewed have all looked at me blankly. And they have said, eventually they would stammer something like, in Papua New Guinea, well, I helped the church get a piece of land.
Yeah.
I interviewed the Minister for Social Services in Jamaica. Lots of poor people. Asked him that question. He eventually said, I've adopted 19 children. Now that's very worthwhile, I'm sure.
Mm.
But it didn't say anything about the influence of Adventism on the policies he pursued. It didn't
No.
answer my question.
No.
In other words, Adventists have not been prepared for being in positions of power. They've not been taught to do anything apart from you should not campaign on the Sabbath and you shouldn't drink.
Yeah.
And you've got to be a good Adventist and set a good example. But the
Mm.
church has said nothing about what do you do about the ills of society.
Mm.
What sort
Yeah.
of example does an Adventist set in that way when they
Yeah.
come to power?
Yeah.
So that's the story of Adventists in government, and according to that chapter in my first volume.
I tell you what, I think you're the greatest journalist Adventism has ever seen. And what an honor it has been to interview you today, Ron. I really appreciate your time. And I now have that sense of urgency to to encourage you and those watching. I know Andrew Skeggs and also Robert Lindbeck are watching. They might be interested in contacting you and helping you. They've got great minds and very good at ordering thoughts and structures and whatnot. So I'll just throw that out there. Have you found, just to bring it back to the main topic of the series,
Sure.
and I've said this a lot during the series, which also initially it was going to be a focus on suppressed Adventists from women's ordination to the LGBT plus community, but it has lent more to the LGBT plus community as far as stories and conversations go. Just things flowed that way, happened that way. But in both situations, and I've said this a lot, it seems to me there's just been a wealth of contributions that could have been made to the church that have just been let go because of gender or because of being part of the LGBT community. And it strikes me in chatting to you, and I mean that in all sincerity, I don't think anyone has done the amount of journalistic work you have done, such an important document ever within Adventism. But it strikes me that you haven't been given the credit you deserve. And I often note that people that are from the gay community, the LGBT plus community, are often given the most limited jobs within the church, even less so than women in many ways. Has that caused you any bitterness? And what is your response to the thousands of others who could have contributed so much to the denomination that have fallen by the wayside potentially as well? Now, this doesn't in any way limit the power and influence of what you've done. I think that's going to shine as brightly as anything, no matter what, regardless of suppression or trying to keep you down. It's going to bubble to the surface, just guaranteed. So I'm not saying your work has been diminished, but I'm just saying that I bet it has been challenged and met with obstacles and whatnot. But just in closing, I'd love you to share a little bit your thoughts on that, the suppression of creativity that could have been within the church, and also some measure of hope you can offer to the LGBT plus and women ordination supporters within the Adventist community. Is there some hope you could leave us with to finish off this season?
Okay. I need to say that I'm very much a supporter of women in ministry. I'm still the organizer. I used to live in Asheville, North Carolina for 3.5 years. And while I was there, I got pretty cheesed off with what I was hearing in church. The churches were conservative. And they also found out that I was gay, and I wasn't asked to do anything.
Yeah.
When I first went there, I played the organ and led the song services for about 3 months, and then they found out and nothing. And which is the way it works.
And that's what I'm referring to. That's exactly what I'm referring to. That kind of here's a gift. Here's a gifted person. Oh, as soon as we found out you're a gay or whatever, off you go. That's got to hurt.
Yes, it did hurt, and it was particularly strange because I was new to the city. I really, and I was trying to finish my books, and so I didn't have time to go and do a lot of other social things. So that my social stuff pretty much had to be the church, and yet I was sort of not. I sat alone in the congregation until an old lady came and decided she wanted to sit next to me, and she became a good friend. But there were other people who looked after me, but but they were doing their duty in looking after me in potlucks and things like that. I have lots of allergies, and they made sure there was always food for me to eat, and that was very kind of them. And but they didn't want me to do anything. I wasn't allowed to do anything in the church, and so I formed it. I'm a forum person, and I formed a forum chapter, and I'm still the director of the forum in Asheville. And when I moved here, I realised there was no one really who had any contacts among the members who could take over. So I said I would continue to organise their meetings, and which meant that we became Zoom forum chapter a year before COVID, and we're still a Zoom chapter. And the speaker who I had last Sabbath was the director of TEAM. TEAM, that's the organisation called Time for Equality in Adventist Ministry. It was formed in the late 80s out of the Association of Adventist Women with the direct purpose of encouraging and helping with funds women to go through seminary. And they began mostly in America and the obvious seminaries, But after the 2015 General Conference session, they decided, and the disaster of women's ordination being voted down yet again, they and there was a sort of a feeling of revolution in America at that time over it, because basically the decision stopped us officially from being able to do it, and then came all the conflict with Ted Wilson because some unions decided to do it, and but they after 2015, so for the past 6-7 years, they've been devoting their funds, and these funds have grown enormously, to sending people in the developing world, especially in Africa and in South America, to study theology. And there's some fascinating stuff happening. She spoke, but she also had two women who they'd helped speak with her and tell their stories. One was a Kenyan woman who still doesn't have a job in the church, even though she's got a PhD. But she's a feminist, and she's wanting to be a pastor. And she's thinking of forming her own church and pastoring it. And
in Kenya.
In Kenya, yes.
Yeah. Do you know her name at all?
Yes, Jeannie Mogusu, Mogusu. Mogusu.
Right. If someone's watching and could share a link to her in some way, that'd be interesting to follow up.
She's written articles in Adventist Today.
Yeah, okay.
That's how I know her personally.
Yeah.
But it turns out that she's the representative team in that division, in the Central East African division, East Central African division, and and she's got dozens of women students studying theology, and they're mostly going to the college in Uganda because it's cheaper.
Yeah.
But they're going, and there's pressure rising, obviously, to employ them. But the church is hiring them for a year as an evangelist to found a church, and then taking that group of people they've baptized. Well, they can't baptize the women because they're not ordained. Can't baptize
Mm.
there, and then giving the church to a male pastor who's probably got 15 churches to look after. And the she told the story about a woman who started a group among the deaf, and she, the deaf are neglected,
Mm.
and
Mm.
she started a sign language um, worship group for the deaf
Mm.
in Kenya, and um, and then she was persuaded to go to the seminary. Well, she announced she was going to the seminary and to the college in Kenya, and the union said that they would hire her when she came out to do that work with the deaf. And when she graduated, she didn't get the promised job, and the job
Mm-hmm.
was given to a man, and the whole work is falling apart because he's not nearly as good as she was.
Yeah, see.
That's according to Jeannie's story. The third person who was speaking was a pastor from China, where there's
Mm.
lots of women pastors, and
Mm.
and 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 she, both of them were extremely interesting. So I think the team is doing really important work, and that the situation is starting to change. So that,
Mm.
for example, in Brazil, which is a really conservative church,
Mm.
they have in the last few months, for the first time, decided to ordain women as elders.
Wow.
Even though that was voted by the General Conference decades ago, it had
Mm.
not happened in Brazil, but it's now happening.
Mm.
And they regard that as a sign that now they're trying to get some of these women to go to seminary there.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
So yes, I'm very excited about team and about that approach to changing things.
Yeah. Yeah.
When it comes to the LGBTs, I've often said I don't think that anything will happen for us at the top of the church until something happens for the women. One issue at a time, I think.
Mm.
Um, but meanwhile, of course, as I said last week, there's been major changes, and most recently and most exciting, Loma Linda went from being a university that would expel its medical students
Mm.
and not give them recommendations to go somewhere else
Yeah. Yeah.
once they were found to be gay or LGBT. And
Mm.
it went from that to being a welcoming university,
Mm. Mm.
and officially so. And the whole atmosphere has changed.
Mm.
And if Loma Linda can change, it is often the lead, and others follow.
The litmus test.
Yes.
Someone's just written, this has been absolutely fascinating. That's a nice message for us
Yes.
to get as we close up this season and this conversation for today. I want to ask one more question pertaining to you as a gay Seventh-day Adventist. So this is a specific question, not speaking broadly to the community, but what advice, having lived an Adventist your whole life, you're 82, a gay Adventist, what advice would you give to a gay Adventist young person about to embark on the life ahead of them? Is there anything in parting you'd like to just share with them to give them a bit of encouragement?
It is difficult to be a gay Adventist, and that is sad, because the biggest changes happen among people who know gay people and LGBT people, and but it's difficult, and it's difficult to find a mate. Um, um, you know, in an Adventist church, if I remember when I was a member of the Toowoomba Church. I grew up in Toowoomba, and as a teenager I was in Toowoomba, west of Brisbane, and there was rejoicing every time a new friendship was formed, because this would be a new Christian home. Well, it's difficult to find out who the other gay Adventists in your church are. And if you did find them, what would happen? Could you sit together? It's difficult.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think that it's really important to encourage Adventists to find Adventists, and because people who understand each other, and kinship plays an important role in that. At least that's one place where we can meet, and I think kinship's a really important organisation, and I think that Floyd is doing a really wonderful job as the president these days. But so I encourage people to be active in kinship, to try to change the church, to try to look for a church where they're going to be comfortable. That's in big cities, you can sometimes find that. But if you're not in a big city, you don't have much choice. All you can do is to let people know you and see if what they do to you when they find out about you. Now, it is changing, and the most important thing that's changing is the next generation, because the next generation has decided that this is a really litmus test issue. Yes. And just as when after the General Conference votes in 1990 and 1995 against the ordination of women, there was tremendous upset among the young women. They're still up. The newest generation of women is just as upset. But the interesting thing is that even more, the focus has gone on the LGBTQs, and these are big issues. These are not only issues now in colleges; they're issues in academies. Because when do you find out who you're attracted to? It's at puberty usually, and so that's they find out, and the academies are not being very very comfortable places yet that I've heard of. There's some controversy flying around Loma Linda at the moment, because what used to be a more comfortable situation is there's a change of administration, and there's been a change.
Yeah.
And it's become much more difficult. So it's difficult, but we have to keep pushing on. And I decided that in my life, I was an Adventist. It had made a big difference to who I was, formed me, and I was able to stay because of the church situation that I got in New York, with the forum, because that gave me a comfortable, accepting environment. We need to create comfortable, accepting environments.
Yes.
And these days, it's possible to do Zoom worship on kinship, and camp meeting is a really important experience. So that's when we meet each other face to face, and more at regional meetings. So all I can do is to encourage, and say it's not going to be easy, but we're getting more and more support at the grassroots, and more parents are recognizing, more people are knowing LGBT people, and realizing that we're Christians too, and that we're good people, and so there is hope, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good place to leave our conversation. There's so many people I would want to thank, but if I start, I will, for this season, this series, if I start, we'll have a whole 2 hours just thanking people. But I, like you said, and I was going to pay special mention to Floyd Painowitz, who is doing a great job there with Kinship, the little movement that you helped found and get off the ground. You must be proud of seeing it grow and develop. And I want to give a quick plug to Floyd's new podcast that he's running there. And the episode number 9 already is up and available. If you just go and check out SDA Kinship Facebook, it's called Kinship Connects, CONNECTS, and it is a really great podcast. So highly recommend you that viewers go and check that out. Well, that's it. Thank you, everyone, for being part of this series. Next week, as I said, I'll be interviewing Steve Daly, and that's going to be a fascinating conversation. And hopefully my interview with Mark Bro about David Koresh will be next week also. If you're a former SDA, I'm wanting to have some interviews with you next season. So please send me a private message and would love to hear your story. I think it's fascinating for Adventists to learn by hearing the stories shared by former Adventists. So, but thank you, Ronald Lawson. Great to have you on the program, and wow, look forward to having you next season as well. Everyone, if you can click that love heart, let the love hearts flow on our Facebook page. If you're watching on YouTube, please click the subscribe button. We really need to lift those numbers. Until next time, Ron, it's been great chatting with you. Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for having me around.